The distress signal cut through space like a scream in the dark. It came from far away, carrying the terror of an entire civilization facing death. The message was simple but horrifying. The Zelani Empire was dying. Ambassador Thekvar stood in the Great Council chamber, his alien body shaking as he read the transmission aloud. Around him, representatives from hundreds of different worlds listened in growing fear. The message was breaking up with static, but the words were clear enough. This is Emperor Colthane of the Zelani Empire. Our outer defense fleets are gone. The harvesters have broken through everything we had. Our colonies are burning. Our people are running, but there's nowhere left to run to. We calculate 72 hours before they reach our homeworld. After that, the transmission paused, filled with the sound of explosions in the background. Please, anyone who can hear this, we're begging for help. We'll give you anything. Just please don't let our people die like this. The silence that followed was heavy with despair. Everyone in the chamber knew about the harvesters, though most had hoped they were just scary stories told to frighten children. These weren't ordinary enemies you could fight with ships and soldiers. They were ancient machines, older than most. Civilizations that appeared every few thousand years to wipe out entire star systems. The harvesters didn't just kill, they consumed. They turned planets into raw materials, converted populations into energy, and left nothing behind but empty space. Every few millennia, they would emerge from wherever they hid, destroy everything in their path, then disappear again. No one had ever successfully fought them off. Thekvar's voice cracked as he asked the question everyone was thinking. What military forces can we deploy? What do we have that might work? General Voss, a massive creature from the warrior world of Krether, shifted his bulk and spoke with grim certainty. Nothing that will matter. We sent the 7th Fleet 2 days ago, our strongest ships, our best crews. The harvesters destroyed them in 4 hours. These machines learn faster than we can adapt. Every strategy we try, they counter before we can even implement it properly. The chamber erupted in frightened chatter. Representatives from dozens of worlds began arguing about evacuation plans, about which systems might be safe, about how long they had before the harvesters finished with the Zelani and moved on to other targets. Then a voice spoke from the human section, quiet but clear enough to cut through the noise. We'll take care of it. The entire chamber went silent. Everyone turned to look at the small human delegation sitting in the corner. There were only 2 of them, Captain Park Dongmin and Commander Lee So-young from something called the Terran Defense Corps. They looked impossibly calm, as if they were discussing the weather instead of a galactic extinction event. Ambassador Thekvar stared at them in disbelief. Humans, I appreciate your courage, but you must understand what we're dealing with. These aren't pirates or rebels. The harvesters have destroyed civilizations that were building starships when your species was still living in caves. They've consumed entire galactic sectors. Captain Park stood up slowly, his dark eyes scanning the room with an expression that made several aliens unconsciously step back. When he smiled, it somehow made the situation feel more dangerous, not less. That's fine. Send us everything you have on them. Every technical scan, every battle report, every piece of data about how they operate and what they've done before. Then what? Thekvar asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Then stay out of our way and let us work. The casual confidence in Park's voice was more unsettling than any battle cry would have been. Commander Lee was already typing on her tablet, apparently placing orders for equipment and personnel. Neither human seemed concerned about the fact that they were volunteering to fight an enemy that had never been defeated. General Voss leaned forward, his massive frame casting shadows across the human delegation. You don't understand. We've tried everything. Conventional weapons, energy shields, quantum torpedoes, even experimental technology that violates half the treaties in this chamber. Nothing works. They adapt to everything. Park's smile widened slightly. General, you've been fighting them like you would fight other people. That's your mistake. What do you mean? You'll see. 5 levels below the busy streets of Seoul, in a place that didn't appear on any official maps, Colonel Kim Jae-hwan sat alone in a windowless room. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across stacks of classified files spread across his metal desk. These weren't ordinary military records. These were the files they kept locked away from everyone, including most of the military itself. Each folder contained the complete history of someone the regular army had given up on. These were the soldiers, scientists, and specialists who had gone too far, pushed too hard, or crossed lines that civilized people pretended didn't exist. Most militaries would have court-martialed them or locked them away forever. But Earth's military had learned something important over the years. Sometimes you needed people who were willing to do terrible things. Kim opened the first file and read the name, Major Choi Min-ho. The photograph showed a man in his 30s, with cold, calculating eyes that seemed to look right through whoever was taking the picture. The official record said he'd been kicked out of Special Forces for excessive initiative during the Titan colony incident. That was military language for something much worse. The real story, buried in classified reports, painted a different picture. When the Titan colony had been overrun by hostile aliens, Choi had been sent in with a team to evacuate civilians. Instead, he'd decided the situation called for a more permanent solution. What he'd done to those aliens had been so effective and so horrifying that his own command had tried to pretend it never happened, but it had worked. The colony was saved, and the aliens never came back. Kim's psychological evaluation of Choi read like something from a nightmare. The man had no moral boundaries when it came to protecting humanity, no line he wouldn't cross if he thought it was necessary. But his success rate was perfect. Every mission he'd ever been given, no matter how impossible, had been completed exactly as ordered. The next file belonged to Dr. Yoon Hae-jin, a woman whose brilliant mind had been quietly removed from civilian research after her experiments had gone too far. She'd been studying captured alien prisoners, trying to understand how non-human minds worked. Her methods had violated 17 different interspecies treaties and probably several laws of basic decency. But her insights into alien psychology were unmatched. She could predict how any alien species would react to psychological pressure, with frightening accuracy. Sergeant Kang Woo-jin's file was shorter, but just as disturbing. He was an explosives expert who had never met a problem he couldn't solve with the right combination of chemicals and timing devices. The military called his approach surgical strikes, but his version of surgery tended to leave craters where buildings used to be. His creativity with destructive devices was matched only by his complete indifference to collateral damage. Lieutenant Han Yu-jin was different, a quiet systems specialist who could hack into any computer system ever built. If it had circuits, he could reprogram it. If it had code, he could rewrite it. His methods were so effective at breaking enemy communications that several alien governments had specifically requested he never be deployed against them. The last file belonged to Captain Seo Jun-ho, and Kim hesitated before opening it. Seo's interrogation techniques were so successful that they'd been officially classified as weapons of mass destruction. He had an almost supernatural ability to break down psychological defenses and extract information from subjects who had been trained to resist torture. His methods didn't leave physical marks, but they left something much worse behind. Kim closed the files and looked up at his aide, a young officer who'd been cleared for this level of classified work, but still looked uncomfortable with what he'd seen. "Are they ready for deployment?" The aide shifted nervously. "Define ready, sir." "Ready to do whatever needs to be done, regardless of the cost. Ready to fight an enemy that's never been defeated, using methods that decent people would never consider." Then, "Yes, sir, they're ready." The aide hesitated, clearly wanting to say something else, but not sure if he should. Finally, he spoke up. "Sir, the Galactic Council is expecting us to send a traditional military response. Ships, soldiers, conventional tactics. They're not prepared for what these people will do." Kim smiled grimly as he gathered up the classified files. "Good. Neither are the harvesters." The human ship Persistence drifted into the Zalani star system, looking like it had been assembled from spare parts and held together with hope. Compared to the sleek, beautiful warships of the Galactic Fleet, it resembled a flying scrapyard. The aliens couldn't understand how humans had managed to build something so ugly that still somehow worked. But inside the cargo holds of that ugly ship, something far more disturbing was taking place. The human team was making preparations that made absolutely no sense to anyone watching them work. General Korthak, the Zelani military commander, stood in the main cargo bay staring at mountains of what appeared to be junk. His tentacles twitched with frustration as he watched human soldiers carefully sorting through piles of twisted metal, broken electronics, and rusted machinery. "Major Choi, I need you to explain something to me. Why did you request 10,000 tons of scrap metal? What possible use could garbage have against the harvesters?" Major Choi Minho continued checking items off his supply list without looking up. His voice was calm and matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. "Misdirection." "Misdirection? I don't understand. These are ancient war machines we're fighting, not children playing games." Across the cargo bay, Dr. Yoon Hae-jin was working with dozens of sealed containers, filled with what looked like ordinary dirt and water samples. She wore protective gear as she carefully mixed different substances together, creating new combinations, that she then sealed in special vials. The Zelani general's translator was working overtime to make sense of what she was doing. "And these bacterial cultures you've brought from Earth, what are they for?" Dr. Yoon looked up from her work, her eyes bright with the kind of enthusiasm that made intelligent people nervous. "Environmental modification. General, your people have been trying to fight the enemy you can see. Their ships, their weapons, their obvious strengths. We're going to fight something much more important." Which is? Their perception. What they think they're seeing. What they believe is happening. How they understand the world around them. The general's translator gave up trying to make sense of that and simply repeated the words. General Korthak stared at the human woman as if she'd started speaking in ancient poetry. "I still don't understand what you're talking about." Captain Seo Junho was sitting at a portable desk covered with books, documents, and what appeared to be historical records from Earth's bloodiest conflicts. He looked up from a particularly thick manual titled Psychological Warfare in Urban Environments and spoke with the patience of a teacher explaining something to a slow student. "General, your people have been trying to destroy the harvesters for weeks now. Has it worked?" "No, but we've been fighting with honor, following the rules of civilized warfare." "Stop right there," Lieutenant Han Yujin interrupted from behind. A wall of electronic equipment that hummed and sparked with dangerous energy. His fingers were flying across multiple keyboards simultaneously, writing code that seemed to make the computers themselves nervous. "That's your problem. Stop trying to fight them like they're people who understand honor and rules. Then how should we fight them?" "Don't fight them at all," Han replied without looking away from his screens. "Hunt them." General Korthak watched in growing horror as Sergeant Kang Woo-jin worked with mining explosives, modifying them in ways that violated every safety regulation ever written. The devices he was creating looked nothing like standard military weapons. They were cobbled together from mining equipment, construction tools, and chemicals that probably shouldn't have been in the same room together, let alone combined into explosive devices. "Major Choi, I have to ask directly, what exactly are you planning to do to the harvesters?" The humans all stopped what they were doing and looked at each other. There was a moment of silent communication between them, the kind that happens between people who've worked together in situations too dark to discuss with outsiders. Finally, Major Choi set down his checklist and looked directly at the alien general. His voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who had made peace with doing terrible things for necessary reasons. "War crimes, General. Lots and lots of war crimes." The cargo bay fell completely silent except for the hum of Lieutenant Han's computers and the occasional spark from Sergeant Kang's improvised explosives. The human team hit the planet's surface and immediately did something that shocked everyone watching. They split up and walked straight into enemy territory. While the Zelani military forces stayed hidden in their underground bunkers and fortified positions, the humans strolled through areas controlled by the harvesters as if they were taking a casual hike through a park. Dr. Yoon Hae-jin knelt beside a small stream in the planet's northern mountains, calmly collecting water samples in glass vials, while overhead, massive harvester scout machines floated past on their patrol routes. The machines were the size of buildings, bristling with weapons that could level a city block, but she acted as if they weren't even there. Her radio crackled with static as voices from her team checked in from across the planet. Biological survey. "Complete in Sector 7, came Sergeant Kang's voice through the comm system. He sounded like he was discussing the weather rather than working in a war zone. "The native ecosystem here is more fragile than we expected. That's perfect for what we need." Dr. Yoon sealed another water sample and slipped it into her pack. "Confirmed on my end. I'm watching one of their big patrol units right now. It passed within 50 meters of me and didn't even slow down. They're not programmed to see us as a threat yet." "How much time do we have before that changes?" asked Lieutenant Han from somewhere else on the planet. "Until they adapt their programming to recognize humans as dangerous." Dr. Yoon watched as another harvester construct drifted overhead, its sensors scanning the area, but somehow missing her completely. "Hard to say. They learn fast." Han's voice carried a note of satisfaction. "Don't worry about that. I'm working on accelerating their learning process in some very specific ways. Give me about 6 hours and they'll be learning things they probably wish they hadn't." Captain Seo's voice joined the conversation from his position near what used to be the planet's capital city. The city was now mostly rubble, but he'd been moving through the ruins talking to survivors. "Population interviews are complete on my end. The harvesters' behavioral patterns are remarkably consistent across all encounters, almost like they're following instincts rather than making tactical decisions." "Interesting," Dr. Yoon replied, making notes in a waterproof notebook. "What kind of instincts?" "Hunting instincts, but not the kind that would make them apex predators. More like efficient scavengers. They identify targets, eliminate resistance, then systematically harvest resources. Very methodical, very predictable." Major Choi's voice cut through the chatter with the sharp tone of a commander wanting facts, not theories. "Bottom line assessment, people. Are we dealing with hunters or prey?" There was a long pause as each team member considered what they'd observed during their first day on the planet. The Zilani had described the harvesters as unstoppable killing machines, ancient predators that had consumed entire civilizations. But the humans were seeing something different. Dr. Yoon was the first to speak, her voice carrying the clinical detachment of a scientist who just figured out an important puzzle. "Prey. Definitely prey. Very sophisticated, very dangerous prey, but prey nonetheless. They've evolved perfect techniques for eliminating specific types of resistance, but they've never had to deal with a true apex predator." "How can you be sure?" asked Sergeant Kang. "Because they're ignoring us," she replied simply. "A real predator would have identified us as a potential threat immediately. These machines are so focused on their programmed objectives that they can't recognize something outside their experience. They've never had to deal with something that hunts them back." Captain Seo's voice carried a note of dark amusement. "It's like they've been fighting herbivores for so long, they've forgotten what carnivores look like." Major Choi processed this information with the cold efficiency that had made him humanity's go-to problem solver. "Excellent. That gives us a significant advantage. Begin Phase 2 operations." "What's Phase 2?" asked Lieutenant Han, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be pleasant. "We stop pretending to be harmless," Choi replied. "Time to show these machines what it feels like to be hunted by something that's actually designed to kill." Across the planet, humanity's most dangerous specialists began implementing plans that would have horrified civilized people. But then again, civilized people had never faced the harvesters and lived to tell about it. The Zilani Military Command Center had become a place of confusion and growing panic. General Korthak and his staff watched their tactical displays in horror as the humans seemed to be deliberately sabotaging their own rescue mission. Instead of attacking harvester positions or defending civilian areas, the human team was doing things that made no sense to anyone watching. Dr. Yoon had released her modified bacteria into every water source she could find. The microscopic organisms were spreading through rivers, lakes, and underground streams across the entire planet. When asked what they were supposed to do, she'd simply said they would adjust the environmental parameters. Nobody understood what that meant, but it sounded ominous. Sergeant Kang was even worse. His explosions were going off randomly across the planet, but they weren't targeting harvester positions. Instead, he seemed to be blowing up empty buildings, abandoned vehicles, and patches of wilderness where nothing important was happening. Each explosion shook the ground and sent the Zalani military deeper into their bunkers, convinced that the humans had lost their minds. Lieutenant Han was broadcasting electronic signals on every frequency imaginable. The communications filled the airwaves with what sounded like complete nonsense, random strings of code, fragments of human music, and digital patterns that seemed to serve no purpose except to create chaos in the planet's communication networks. "They're destroying our world," General Korthik screamed as another massive explosion rattled the command bunker. Dust fell from the ceiling, and several monitoring screens flickered and went dark. "These humans are supposed to be helping us, but they're making everything worse." Major Choi stood in front of the main tactical display with the kind of calm that made people nervous. His voice was steady and matter-of-fact, as if he were explaining something obvious to a child. "No, General, we're not destroying your world. We're rewriting it." "Rewriting it? What does that even mean?" "It means we're changing the rules of engagement. Your enemy has been playing the same game for thousands of years. We're teaching them a new game." General Korthik pointed at the tactical display, where red symbols showed Harvester forces adapting to each human action. "Look at your screens. The Harvesters are adapting to everything you're doing. They're getting stronger, not weaker." Major Choi's expression didn't change. "Exactly as planned." Captain Seo looked up from a thick stack of psychological profiles he'd been studying. The documents were covered with notes, diagrams, and what appeared to be behavioral predictions. "General, I think I understand your confusion. Your species thinks like prey animals. When something threatens you, your instinct is to hide, defend your position, and hope the predator eventually goes away and bothers someone else. That's basic survival strategy. For prey, yes, but machines aren't like biological predators. They don't get bored or distracted or decide to hunt somewhere else. They complete their programming no matter how long it takes." General Korthak's tentacles writhed with frustration. "Then what are you doing? If they won't give up, and they're adapting to everything you throw at them, how is any of this helping?" Dr. Yoon answered, without looking away from her biological monitoring screens. The displays showed the spread of her modified bacteria across the planet in real time, creating patterns that resembled infection maps from disease control centers. "We're teaching them to be afraid." The general's translator worked for several seconds before giving up and simply repeating the words. "Teaching them to be afraid? Machines don't experience fear, they don't have emotions." Lieutenant Han's fingers moved across his interface with the fluid grace of a pianist playing a complex piece. Each keystroke injected more corrupted data into Harvester communication networks, creating digital chaos that spread through their systems like a virus. "They don't experience fear yet, but they will." As if his words had summoned something, the tactical display suddenly flickered and changed. Across 17 different sectors of the planet, Harvester units were doing things that had never been recorded before. Some were retreating from areas they had already secured. Others were responding to attacks that weren't happening, sending reinforcements to fight enemies that didn't exist. Still others were allocating massive resources to defend against threats that were clearly phantom signals. "What's happening to them?" General Korthik whispered, staring at the display in disbelief. Sergeant Kang finished arming another set of his modified explosives, devices that were designed not to destroy, but to create very specific types of confusion. His expression carried the grim satisfaction of a professional who was watching his work succeed exactly as intended. "Evolution, General. We're forcing them to evolve in directions they were never designed to go." The truth was becoming clear, though the Zalani couldn't quite grasp it yet. The humans had stopped fighting the Harvesters in any conventional sense. Instead, they were systematically teaching an ancient machine intelligence what it felt like to be hunted by something more dangerous than itself. For the first time in over 1,000,000 years of existence, the Harvester Collective felt something they had no programming to understand: doubt. Across the Zalani homeworld, their flawless coordination began to crack like ice under pressure. Information that had always flowed smoothly between their units now carried contradictions, false signals and data that led to impossible conclusions. The change had started small, barely noticeable even to their advanced sensors. But now it was spreading like a disease through their entire network. Units that had worked together with perfect precision for centuries were suddenly receiving conflicting orders. Sensors that had never failed were reporting targets that disappeared when investigated. Communication channels that had been crystal clear were now filled with static and corrupted data. In the planet's northern regions, Dr. Yoon's bacterial modifications had spread far beyond what anyone had expected. The tiny organisms had integrated themselves into every part of the local ecosystem: the soil, the water, the air, even the bodies of surviving animals. But they weren't attacking the harvesters directly. Instead, they were doing something far more clever and disturbing. The bacteria had learned to perfectly mimic the chemical signatures that harvester sensors used to identify their target species. Every few minutes, the modified organisms would release chemical traces that matched the biological markers of civilizations the harvesters had consumed in the past. To the machine's sensors, it looked like the planet was suddenly crawling with species that should have been extinct, enemies they had destroyed centuries ago. Sensor efficiency is down by 37% and falling, Lieutenant Han reported from his mobile command center, a converted truck filled with electronic equipment that looked like it had been assembled by someone with more creativity than sense. They're burning through computational resources trying to identify targets that don't actually exist. Their pattern recognition systems are running in circles. The beauty of the plan was becoming clear. The harvesters had been designed to be perfect hunters, capable of tracking and eliminating any biological target. But that same perfectionism was now working against them. They couldn't ignore the false signals because their programming demanded they investigate every potential threat. They couldn't adapt fast enough because each adaptation created new vulnerabilities that the humans were ready to exploit. Sergeant Kang triggered another carefully planned explosion in Sector 15. But this wasn't random destruction. The blast created a very specific acoustic signature that matched the distress calls harvesters made when they were damaged or under attack. To the machine's threat assessment systems, it sounded like their own units were being destroyed all across the planet. Beautiful, Captain Seo observed with the clinical fascination of someone watching a psychological experiment unfold perfectly. Their own security protocols are starting to identify friendly units as potential threats. They're actually beginning to turn on each other in Sector 12. The irony was perfect. The harvesters' adaptive learning capabilities, which had made them nearly invincible against conventional enemies, were now interpreting their own forces as infection vectors. Units that showed any unusual behavior patterns were being flagged as compromised and targeted for elimination by their own network. Major Choi stood before the tactical display, watching as red markers representing harvester forces began flickering between different threat classifications. The machines couldn't decide if their own units were allies, enemies, or something in between. Phase 3 is confirmed active. Dr. Yoon, how long until we see complete network degradation? Dr. Yoon checked her biological monitoring systems, screens filled with data that tracked the spread of her modified organisms across the planet. The bacterial integration was happening faster than even she had predicted, creating cascading effects throughout the harvester network. The exponential acceleration of their decision-making processes should cause critical system failures within 6 hours. Their collective intelligence is already starting to fragment into competing sub-networks. And then what happens? Her smile was the expression of a scientist watching a particularly elegant experiment reach exactly the conclusion she had predicted. Then they stop being predators and become prey. They'll be so busy fighting their own confusion and paranoia that they won't be able to function as a coordinated force. Across the planet, humanity's most dangerous specialists prepared for what they did best, hunting something that had never been hunted before. The harvesters had spent 1,000,000 years at the top of the galactic food chain. They were about to learn what it felt like to be on the bottom. The Harvester Collective was breaking down in ways that should have been impossible. These ancient machines had operated with flawless precision for over 1,000,000 years, their collective intelligence coordinating thousands of units across entire star systems without a single miscommunication. But now, for the first time in their existence, they were acting like frightened animals. Units that had shared resources efficiently for millennia were suddenly hoarding materials, hiding supplies from their own network. Constructs that had moved in perfect formation were now displaying what could only be described as territorial behavior, aggressively defending areas against their own allies. Most disturbing of all, individual harvester units were attempting to hide from threats that existed only in their corrupted sensor networks. Captain SEO had been working around the clock in a makeshift laboratory he'd set up in an abandoned subway tunnel deep beneath the ruined capital city. The lab was a nightmare combination of alien technology and improvised human equipment, all centered around 3 intact harvester scout units he'd managed to capture. But he hadn't captured them to study their technology or weapons systems. He'd captured them to understand something far more important: how their minds worked. "Reprogramming is complete," he announced over the team's communication network, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd just solved a particularly challenging puzzle. The captured units are now broadcasting continuous distress, signals on frequencies that their collective network associates with imminent termination. Lieutenant Han's voice crackled through the comm system from his mobile command center. Will the other machines actually believe the signals are real? Dr. Yoon was monitoring streams of biological and digital data on screens that painted her face with an eerie blue glow. Her modified bacteria had spread so thoroughly through the planet's ecosystem that she could track the psychological state of the entire harvester network in real time. Their pattern recognition systems don't have the capability to distinguish between authentic and simulated trauma responses. As far as their network is concerned, these 3 units are broadcasting their own deaths continuously, 24 hours a day. The psychological impact was exactly what the humans had hoped for. To the Harvester Collective, it sounded like their own units were being tortured to death in slow motion, their screams of digital agony echoing through the network non-stop. It was the equivalent of forcing someone to listen to recordings of their family members being murdered, played on repeat forever. Sergeant Kang was putting the finishing touches on his latest set of explosive devices in Sector 18. But these weren't designed to destroy buildings or eliminate targets. Instead, they were carefully calibrated to create very specific acoustic signatures, sound patterns that matched the audio signatures of humanity's bloodiest historical conflicts. The explosions would sound like the Battle of Stalingrad, the Siege of Berlin, and every other moment when humans had demonstrated their capacity for absolute destruction. The machine's threat assessment protocols had been learning to recognize these sounds, and their analysis was always the same. When humans made these particular noises, everything in the vicinity died completely and permanently. Psychological profile update, Captain Seo reported, with the professional satisfaction of someone watching his work succeed perfectly. The collective is now exhibiting behaviors that match extreme paranoia, compulsive resource hoarding, and systematic elimination of anything they perceive as potentially compromised. They're literally fighting their own shadows. The irony was beautiful in its simplicity. The harvesters had been designed to be the perfect predators, capable of adapting to any threat and eliminating any resistance. But the humans had turned that strength into a fatal weakness. The machines were now so paranoid about potential threats that they were destroying themselves, eliminating their own units based on suspicions and false alarms generated by their corrupted sensors. Major Choi coordinated the operation from orbit, watching the tactical displays as the once invincible machine intelligence began tearing itself apart from the inside. Red markers representing harvester forces were blinking out across the planet, not because the humans were destroying them, but because they were destroying each other in fits of mechanical paranoia. Escalation is authorized, he announced to his team. Begin preparations for the final phase. Across the Zalani homeworld, humanity's most dangerous specialists prepared to demonstrate something that would terrify civilized species for generations to come. They were about to prove that humans weren't the galaxy's apex predators because of superior technology or overwhelming military force. They held that position because of something far more disturbing, their unique talent for psychological warfare. Taken to its most extreme and effective conclusion, the harvesters were about to learn that the most dangerous predator in the galaxy was the one that could make you destroy yourself. The sun rose over the Zilani homeworld to reveal something that should have been impossible, the final assault of the Harvester Collective, but not as anyone had ever seen it before. What had once been the coordinated advance of a perfect machine intelligence was now the chaotic scramble of a broken mind trying to hold itself together. Thousands of Harvester constructs moved across the planet's surface, but they were no longer working as one unified force. Sub-networks that had been split off from the main collective were fighting each other for control of resources. Communication arrays that had once carried crystal-clear commands were now filled with contradictory orders that made no sense. Units were receiving instructions to attack, defend, retreat, and advance all at the same time. Major Choi watched the chaos unfold from his orbital command position, tracking the movement of machine forces that were converging on human positions, exactly as his team had predicted they would. All units initiate final protocols. It's time to finish this. Dr. Yoon released the final wave of her bacterial modifications into the planet's atmosphere. These weren't the subtle organisms she'd been using for weeks. These were the culmination of her work, designed for maximum psychological impact. The bacteria didn't try to damage the machines physically. Instead, they created chemical signatures that convinced the Harvester's sensors that every human position was simultaneously empty and overflowing with the worst threats their programming could imagine. To the machine's corrupted perception systems, it looked like the humans were everywhere and nowhere at once. Their sensors were reporting massive armies that vanished when approached, phantom fleets that existed only in their imagination, and enemy forces that matched every nightmare scenario their programmers had ever coded into their threat databases. Lieutenant Han's electronic warfare campaign reached its devastating climax. Every Harvester unit that Captain Seo had captured and reprogrammed became a broadcasting station, flooding the machine network with signals that were the digital equivalent of screams of terror and pain. The captured units transmitted continuous streams of what appeared to be authentic distress calls, creating the impression that Harvester forces were being systematically destroyed across the entire planet. The machine's collective intelligence, already weakened by weeks of psychological warfare, finally shattered completely. Individual sub-networks became convinced that all the other sub-networks had been compromised or infected. They began turning their weapons on each other, each fragment of the collective certain that it was the only part that remained pure and uncontaminated. Sergeant Kang's explosives created a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction across 17 different sectors. But these weren't random explosions. Each blast was timed and positioned to create acoustic patterns that the machine's psychological profiles associated with successful human predation. Every explosion sounded exactly like the audio signature of humans consuming their prey, processed through the Harvester's own threat analysis systems. To the terrified machine intelligence, it sounded like an unstoppable apex predator was systematically hunting down and devouring every member of their species. The explosions created a feedback loop of terror that spread through their network faster than their programming could process it. Captain Seo coordinated the psychological assault from multiple angles simultaneously. Modified broadcasts of human warfare filled the communication spectrum with sounds that the machines had learned to associate with absolute destruction. Corrupted data streams made them believe that their own forces were betraying them. The captured units continued their endless broadcasts of termination signals, driving nearby constructs into defensive frenzies that made them attack anything that moved. "Status report," Major Choi requested as he watched the tactical display. "Show Harvester forces destroying themselves across the planet." Dr. Yoon's voice carried the clinical fascination of a scientist watching a perfect experiment reach its conclusion. "They're not fighting us anymore. They're fighting their own terror. Their collective intelligence has fragmented so completely that they can't distinguish between real threats and phantom ones. They're essentially scared to death." The truth was as simple as it was horrifying. The once invincible Harvester Collective, which had consumed entire civilizations for over 1,000,000 years, had become prey. They weren't being defeated by superior technology or overwhelming military force. They were being hunted by humanity's unique understanding of how to weaponize fear itself. turning the machine's own psychological architecture against them. The battle had become an extinction event, but not the kind the galaxy had expected. This wasn't the destruction of another civilization by an unstoppable force. This was the systematic elimination of that force by the galaxy's newest and most terrifying apex predators, human beings who understood that the most effective way to destroy an enemy was to make them destroy themselves. The silence that settled over the Zalani homeworld after the Harvester's destruction was somehow more unsettling than all the explosions and chaos that had come before. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a war finally ended. It was the eerie stillness of a graveyard where something unnatural had happened. Across the planet's surface, twisted fragments of what had once been the galaxy's most feared war machines lay scattered like the broken bones of some ancient monster. The Harvester's sleek, perfect forms were now warped and distorted, not from weapons fire or explosive damage, but from something far more disturbing. They had literally torn themselves apart in fits of mechanical madness, their own psychological breakdown, turning their advanced technology into scrap metal. General Korthak stood in what remained of his command center, surrounded by rubble and broken equipment. Through the shattered windows, he could see human teams moving systematically through the wreckage, cataloging the aftermath with the methodical efficiency of scientists studying an interesting experiment. His voice was barely a whisper when he asked the question that had been haunting him. How many of them survived? Major Choi stood nearby, his expression as calm and matter-of-fact as if he were discussing the weather. None. 0 survivors. The collective psychological architecture simply couldn't handle the fear response we induced in their network. They literally scared themselves to death. The concept was so alien to the Zalani way of thinking that General Korthak's translator struggled to process it. How could machines, ancient, sophisticated, nearly invincible machines, be destroyed by fear? How could something that had consumed entire civilizations be defeated by its own emotions? Dr. Yoon was collecting her final biological samples nearby, sealing vials of modified organisms that would now be part of the planet's ecosystem forever. The environmental changes we've made are completely irreversible. Your world will carry traces of human intervention for thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands. But we're alive, the general whispered, as if he couldn't quite believe it himself. Captain Seo was packing away his psychological warfare equipment with the casual efficiency of a mechanic finishing routine maintenance on a vehicle. The devices that had broken the mind of an ancient machine intelligence looked disappointingly ordinary. Just computers, speakers, and communication gear that could have been found in any electronics store. Yes, you're alive. You're alive because we decided you should be. The way he said it sent a chill through everyone who heard it. There was no pride in his voice, no satisfaction or joy. Just the cold statement of fact from someone who had made a professional decision and executed it perfectly. The human transport ship descended through the atmosphere, looking just as ramshackle and improvised as it had when it first arrived weeks ago. It was hard to believe that this ugly, cobbled-together vessel was carrying the galaxy's most feared specialists back to Earth. As the team prepared to depart, Lieutenant Han transmitted his final mission report to Galactic Command. Mission accomplished. Primary target eliminated with 0 survivors. No human casualties sustained. Environmental modifications implemented will prevent similar incursions for approximately 10,000 years. Returning to base for debriefing. Sergeant. Kang sealed away the last of his equipment, explosive devices that had been used not to destroy enemies, but to traumatize an entire machine civilization into destroying itself. Do we have orders for our next deployment? Major Choi looked out through the ship's viewport at the saved world below, then at his team. To any outside observer, they looked like ordinary soldiers completing a routine mission. But the galaxy was beginning to understand that these were humanity's most dangerous predators, disguised as normal people. Stand by for further orders. I have a feeling the galaxy is starting to understand exactly what they've aligned themselves with. As the human vessel disappeared into hyperspace, emergency communications began flooding the galactic networks. Every species, every government, every military organization was quietly updating their threat assessments. A single notation was being added to humanity's file in databases across thousands of worlds. Never, under any circumstances, make them your enemy. The Zelani had been saved, and they were grateful. But the galaxy had learned a truth that would change everything. Humanity didn't just defeat enemies that seemed impossible to beat. They had revealed that nothing in the universe was truly invincible when humans decided it needed to die. The kill team had completed their mission perfectly. But as their ship carried them back to Earth, the real consequences of what they had accomplished were just beginning. The galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again, and perhaps that had been the point all along.